Welcome to the first lecture for ethics. This is the Prolegomena lecture. And Prolegomena is a big word, a fancy word, but it simply means the things that we need to talk about before we can talk about ethics. If you look at the structure of the word, it means the words before. So Prolegomena are the things we have to talk about so that we can intelligently talk about ethics. So we're going to jump into this. Now, if you've never had a philosophy course, if you've never had a logic course, we're going to start off with some fairly abstract subjects. We're going to talk about arguments, we're going to talk about rules of thought and things like that. So in the first couple of lectures, we're going to get into the deep waters of philosophy as it relates to this course. So what I want to encourage you to do is to, if you've never had a class like this, hang on. After the first couple of lectures, we're going to get into some shallower waters where things will be more comfortable, and we'll start talking about ethical issues and different things like that. But at first, we're really going to have to set the stage, and that's what this lecture, the first of our lecture, is about, and the second one will deal with similar things. So, for Prolegomena, the things we're going to talk about in this lecture are defining terms, using arguments, identifying presuppositions, the three laws of thought, different types of arguments, and how to evaluate arguments. Now, this is a lot of stuff. So if you want to watch for a little while, and then if you need to pause the video, come back and finish it later, that's fine. But we're going to cover this in this single presentation. Now, in addition to that, I'm going to have a couple of videos that we're going to watch with the presentation, and some of them you will need to click to and watch them separate. Eventually, I will try to see if I can splice them in here, but right now I can't get the audio to those videos in the course. So I will point you to them, and when we get to that point of the lecture, I'd like you to pause this video, watch the other video, and then come back and resume. The first thing we're going to talk about here is defining terms. So we often take for granted that people understand what we mean when we try to communicate something. When I give instructions, I understand what I'm trying to accomplish, so the instructions make sense to me. However, if I give you instructions, you who do not necessarily understand what I want accomplished may be confused by the instructions. So we need to be very clear. And so to illustrate that, we're going to talk about the squirrel. And we're going to ask the question here, does the man go around the squirrel? So I want you to participate in a thought experiment with me. We'll do a lot of these throughout the semester. A thought experiment is basically where we consider what would take place. We don't have a laboratory for philosophy where we can go in and put things in test tubes and beakers. So we have to do our experiments in a mental fashion. So consider that you are either on campus at the college or that you are in a field or a forest somewhere where there are some trees. And you're probably familiar with squirrels. And so imagine, if you will, an area where there are some trees. Imagine that there is a squirrel on the ground close to a tree, and we are standing not far from that. And I tell you, hey, I want to touch that squirrel. I want to pet that cute little squirrel. So I head towards the squirrel. Well, immediately the squirrel's reaction will almost always be to run towards the closest tree and to climb up the tree a couple of feet and get on the opposite side of the tree from where I am. So I am undeterred, however. I want to pet that squirrel. So I walk around the tree, and what does the squirrel do? The squirrel continues to move around the tree, trying to keep the tree between me and it the entire time. So I circled the tree several times trying to get towards the squirrel. The squirrel always keeps the tree between me and it. Now here's a place where we can watch a video. So this video example we're going to look at now is of a dog and a squirrel, but it's a similar concept. So if you'll watch this, we don't have any audio, but imagine the same kind of concept when we ask the question, does the man go around the squirrel, or in this case, does the dog go around the squirrel? You can see the dog is going around the tree, the squirrel is keeping the tree between itself and the dog, and so they're going around in circles. And the question that we want to consider is, does the dog go around the squirrel or not? Does the dog not go around the squirrel? Well, you can follow that link in the video or in the lecture PowerPoint if you would like, and you can watch the rest of it. It basically does the same thing for a while. But the question is, does the dog go around the squirrel? Does the man go around the squirrel? And so you might say, well, yeah, it's pretty obvious. It certainly goes around. Or you might say, certainly he doesn't go around. The problem here is with ambiguity in the term go around. What do we mean, or what does it mean to go around something? So there's at least two ways we could consider this. If we consider going around something in reference to, say, some objective external factor, or something that's external to the object that we're talking about. In this case, imagine points of a compass. Go around could be defined as passing from the north to the east, to the south, to the west, and back to the north of an object. That could be described as to go around an object. And in that sense, the man would go around the squirrel. The dog went around the squirrel in the video because it passed from the north-south, northeast, southwest, back to the north around that squirrel. So in that sense, if we define go around as points of a compass, passing through that manner, then there's no question. Yes, the dog went around the squirrel. The man goes around the squirrel. However, if we define go around something in relationship to the object itself, to say to go around something means you pass from the front to the side, to the rear, to the other side, and back to the front again, then clearly the answer is no, the man and the dog did not go around the squirrel because they were always facing the underbelly of the squirrel. They were only ever facing one part of the squirrel. So they did not go around the squirrel. Now, this is not to me try to put us in some kind of thing to say we can't even tell whether something goes around somebody. That's not the point. The point is the only way that we can be clear about what we mean is to have clarity in the way we communicate. In this sense, we have to define our terms. In philosophy, often we will define our terms. So if we say that we are presenting a certain position, or if I'm going to argue for a point, I have to define what I am actually arguing or define points of my argument. So in this case, we would have to define go around either in reference to something like points on a compass or in relationship to the object itself before we can have a good argument about whether the man goes around the squirrel or not. So I want you to just remember that. Keep that in mind as we go forward. It's important to define our terms in our communication. It's good in all things, but particularly in philosophy, it is vital. So remember that. The next thing we're going to talk about are using arguments. Now, I'd like you to pause the video and watch the Argument Clinic video. It's a YouTube video. You should be able to follow the hyperlink. If you, for some reason, have a problem with the hyperlink, you can search in YouTube for Argument Clinic Monty Python, and it's about a 6-minute video. You should be able to watch it. I'm going to ask you to pause this video now and then watch that video and then return after you've watched it. I'm now assuming that you have watched the Monty Python Argument Clinic video. So in that video, you would have noticed that, it's a comedy, and I like Monty Python, and hopefully you enjoyed that, and it's poking fun at the idea of arguing, and that it can simply, be, you have discussions about whether it's just negating or gainsaying what someone says, or you have the claim there that it's a set of statements to develop a proposition, okay? And so it's kind of a interesting little skit. But when we are talking about arguments, we're not just talking about disagreeing with somebody and saying, no, it isn't, yes, it is, or you're wrong, I'm right. What we're talking about is constructing a set of propositions that claim to prove something. So, a proposition is simply a statement, okay? And you can think of a statement as the ones we have an example on the screen. So, we have all men are mortal. That is a statement. Okay, so that is a proposition. And our arguments that we're going to talk about consist of propositions that make claims, and those are going to be part of the argument. But as we see here, arguments consist of premises and conclusions. So all men are mortal, that's our proposition. That is our first premise, or premise A in this argument. And the next proposition is Socrates is a man. So that's premise B. So we have two premises, and then we have a conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So that is also a statement, Socrates is mortal, but that is the conclusion that we get from the two premises of A and B. So all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so we can conclude, therefore, since Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then Socrates himself must be mortal. So that is a very basic form of an argument, and it's very simple. And so hopefully you can see when we're talking, there's no passion, there's no emotion involved in here. It is simply statements and conclusions that, and the point of this then is to try to prove something or try to demonstrate something. So we're going to be using arguments throughout the course. And so when I talk about arguments, we'll go back there. This is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about emotional, heated discussions. We're talking about rational statements that are trying to come to a conclusion. Okay. Now, these statements in ethics, we will be discussing moral issues. So people may have emotional attachment to their arguments, but the emotional aspect is not really relevant for the argument. The argument itself is what we're going to look at. Now, we're going to also have to talk about presuppositions. So presuppositions are things that we all have. In fact, we probably could not live without presuppositions. So our first point here, to presuppose something, is to accept something as true without conscious reflection or argument. So you are probably sitting somewhere, maybe in front of a computer, maybe in front of another device, and you're watching this video. Before you sat down, you probably presupposed that the chair would support your weight. You may have actually checked to see if this chair was sturdy, but probably you didn't. When you got up out of bed this morning, you probably assumed that the home you were in or the room that you were in would not collapse on top of you. You probably didn't check that. When you ate your last meal, whether you prepared it yourself or you purchased it somewhere else, you probably just presupposed that it was safe to eat. You probably didn't do testing and all of those kind of things on the food to make sure that it was safe to eat. We often presuppose things, a lot of things. We presuppose, and the second point says, we often presuppose things like our own existence and the reality of the past. Now, you may say, well, that sounds very strange, but how could we know, I want you to consider this, that you didn't pop into existence only 5 minutes ago, and when you came into existence, you had all of the memories that you have from the moment you came into existence, and so that your reality, the past history that you remember, would be faked. It would not be genuine. How could we know that we didn't just simply pop into existence in a relatively short time ago, and all of our memories are not genuine? They are fake. We probably don't have an argument for that. Now, you may say that sounds crazy. Well, it may sound bizarre, but do we have a good reason to think that's not the case? And well, we could point to our memories, but then our memories in this example would indeed be faked. So the things that we would be relying on to prove that this didn't happen would be themselves suspect. So, and I'm not suggesting that we simply popped into existence 5 minutes ago with all of our memories, but we suppose this. We accept it as true without conscious reflection or argument. I presume that you probably accept that you exist in a very similar way. You don't say, well, I'm questioning whether I really do exist. Could I simply be a computer program or a hallucination in another person's mind? We don't question those kind of things. We tend to take reality at face value. So that's not a bad thing. However, it is pointing out the fact that we have presuppositions. We assume that the world we're living in is the actual world. It's not a virtual, made-up world. We assume that we have been around as long as we remember, and we don't necessarily have arguments for that. We presuppose that when you get into your vehicle, or you eat food that's been prepared for you, or you lay in a bed or sit on a chair, that all of these things are going to function the way that they are supposed to. We don't necessarily check everything else out. In fact, we could not live our lives if we had to verify everything and not take for granted or make assumptions about the way the world is. So we have lots of presuppositions. Why do we talk about this in ethics? It's because we also have presuppositions about values and moral behavior. Just like we have presuppositions about the sturdiness of the houses, or the reliability of our vehicles, or the trustworthiness, the wholesomeness of the food that we eat, we also have presuppositions about what is good and what is bad, what is moral and what is immoral. And just because I have a presupposition about something does not mean that you will have it also. We have a varied background of students in this class, and we probably have very different conceptions of what is the right behavior in certain circumstances. Now, because we also have a lot of similarities, we may have a lot of similarities in the way we view issues, but we will have some differences. So what we're going to do is try to identify the things that we presuppose. So we're not going to necessarily state this, but when you make an ethical argument, you're presupposing that reality is actually the case, that we are not simulations in a computer or fantasies in a person's dream. You are presupposing that the world is actually the way it is. And so there are many presuppositions. Sometimes you need to list those. And not everything about reality, but if you're going to argue for certain positions, you may presuppose that human life is special, or it's valuable, or that human freedom is special or valuable. So you may not necessarily argue for the reason why you think humans are valuable or that freedom is valuable, but you may presuppose that in your argument. So you would need to identify that. When you are reading through your textbook and you're reading through other philosophical papers and things that we have assigned, I want you to pay attention and see if you can identify some of the presuppositions, whether they are explicitly noted by the authors or if they are simply implicit and they don't tell you that they have them. And you will find, I would love to have some of the discussions as we go along about your Rachel's and Rachel's text, if you can identify some of the presuppositions that you find from your authors, because they do have some that are not necessarily overtly stated in the text. So I would like to, if you think about that, please put that in the discussion. So we all have presuppositions. Presuppositions are not necessarily bad. They can be bad. And so if I presuppose something that is perhaps contrary to something I'm testing, or that would potentially prejudice my conclusions, then I need to be aware of them and try to set them aside. We can't set aside all of our presuppositions, but we can at least identify them. So they're important for us. We can't exist without them, but we need to make sure that they don't have too much of an influence on our work. Okay. Next are the laws of thought. Now these are going to be some things that I hope that you will be able to understand. I like to ask for clarity. So if you have any questions, make sure you bring it up in the lecture discussion thread. These laws of thought are vital for us to have any kind of argumentation at all. There are three of them: the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, and the law of identity. We'll go through each of these. But there's the quick definition. Let's go on to the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction states that no proposition can be both true and false at the same time and in the same sense. Okay? So we see here a couple of propositions that we're going to kind of look at with this. So no proposition that we can have can be both true and false at the same time in the same sense. That's important for you to understand all of those aspects. A proposition can be true and false at different times. So the proposition we have here, that Barack Obama is currently president, is currently, that is a false statement. Okay? But a couple of years ago, that was a true statement. When I originally put this PowerPoint together, it was a true statement. And a few years before that, it was a false statement, because Barack Obama became president at one date and then was no longer president at another date. And so the dates between that, then the proposition was true that he is currently president. Dates before that and after that, then it's false that he is currently president. So that does not violate the law of non-contradiction, because the proposition can be true and false at different times. However, it's not possible for, at the same time, Barack Obama to currently be president and it to be false that Barack Obama is currently president. That would be a violation of the law of non-contradiction. So the element of time is one way in which a proposition can be true and false, but they are false at different times. So when it says that no proposition can be both true and false at the same time, and in the same sense, we see an example here how a proposition can be true or false at different times without violating the law of non-contradiction. Now let's look at a proposition can be true or false in different senses. So what do we mean by that? Well, here's another example. Barack Obama is cold. So that's a statement. So suppose that Barack Obama he would be somewhere today, and perhaps he is in the Arctic or on the top of a mountain, and the temperature is very low, and he doesn't have a jacket on. And so it might be true that Barack Obama is cold. Or he could be on a tropical island somewhere with a swimsuit and a nice cool drink, and it may be false that he is cold. So we don't know exactly what that is, but it will have a truth value of either being true or false. So cold could be, in this sense, referring to the temperature around you, the ambient temperature of the environment that you're in. But cold could also have a sense of emotional distance. So we might say we're using cold in the sense of he's a cold person, not that he's physically cold. And so it could be true that Obama is cold, a cold person. And so if he were on a beach in a swimsuit and he were warm in his environment, then we might say it's false that Barack Obama is cold. But in the sense of being a cold, distant person, if he were a cold, distant person, then he could be both. Then it could be true that he's a cold, distant person, but that it's false that he is in a cold place. And so depending on the way that we use the word cold. And likewise, if he is in the Arctic, he might be cold physically, and he might be a very warm person emotionally, so it might be false that he's cold emotionally. So he could be cold physically and warm emotionally, and so it could be true in one sense and false in another sense. So that's what we're talking about with the senses of the words. So in what sense you're using words and what you mean by the proposition could change. So you don't have a violation of the law of non-contradiction to say that Barack Obama is cold, it's false because he's on an island, a warm tropical island, but that he's a cold and distant person. So it's also true. The sense cold would be used in different senses there, so you do not violate the law of non-contradiction. But I do want you to think about the law of non-contradiction as a light switch. Okay, so if you go to your light switch and your light switch is either on or off. It can't be both on and off at the same time. And so that's kind of what the law of non-contradiction says. It's not exactly it, but it's an example that hopefully will help. If you have a proposition, then it can't be both true and false. It can be either true or false. At different times, it can be either true or false. That could change. And in different senses, it might be able to change. But it can't be both at the same time in the same sense or the same way. Just like your light switch can't be on and off at the same time. It's either on or off, but it can't be both. Okay? So that's the law of non-contradiction. If you have questions about that, please ask them in the discussion thread. The law of the excluded middle is kind of the opposite of the law of non-contradiction. It says that every proposition must be either true or false. So just like no proposition can be both true and false. Every proposition has to be one or the other. There is no middle ground between true and false. It is binary. There's one or the other, not a place in between. So a proposition cannot be neither true nor false. So, in the same way, your light switch can't be both on and off. That would be the law of non-contradiction. But it has to be one or the other. It has to be either on or off. There's no middle ground between on and off. So when we're talking about propositions, the law of the excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction fit together to say that no proposition has a truth value that is both true and false at the same time, and it has to have a truth value of either true or false. Those are the two propositions, how they fit together. So again, if you have questions, please ask them in the thread. I like to make sure that there's understanding here. It's actually not very complicated, but most of us have not thought about things, propositions or statements and truth and in these kinds of ways. This is important for us, but it may not immediately be clear why it's important, and it may sound a little bit confusing, more confusing than it actually is. So please do ask questions if you're confused, or listen to it again. But the law of non-contradiction, no proposition can be both true and false at the same time and in the same sense. In the law of excluded middle, every proposition must be either true or false. It has to be one or the other. There's no middle ground. The third proposition is the law of identity. And that means that every proposition is identical to itself. And a way you can think about this is, if a proposition is true, then it is true. If it is false, then it is false. Now, we're not going to jump into all of the reasons why this is important. For our purposes, it's not something that we need to spend a lot of time in. However, what I want to help you with is maybe something that will help you understand. A proposition it's a statement. That's one way that we can consider it. And I want you to understand that our propositions are not bound to language. So, if we were to write that, let me see if I can pause there. All right, we're going to try this. It's currently raining. I-N-I-N-G. Okay? All right, so we've got this proposition here. It is currently raining. Now, whether this statement is true or false, again, for the law of non-contradiction, it has to be either true or false, depending on when you're watching this video. And if we define our terms a little more and say, within 100 feet of where you are, so basically right around where you are, we're not talking about throughout the whole world, but it is currently raining is going to be either true or false, depending on whether or not there is actually rain coming from the sky. Okay? It has to be either true or false. It can't be both, and it has to be either one. So wherever you are, it is either currently raining or it is not currently raining, and you can look at that and evaluate that. But the point is, I could write this same concept differently. I could say, it rains now. Okay? That means the same thing. I don't have to, my proposition, it is currently raining and it rains now, they are the same proposition, though they are using different words. And suppose I could write it in another language. Okay, I might be able to, if I know French or German or Spanish, I might write a proposition that it's currently raining, translated into another language. It's still the same proposition. It doesn't change based on the language or the structure of the language that you're writing it in. So, while that's not exactly what we're trying to deal with the law of identity, I do want you to realize, take this opportunity to understand that when we talk about propositions, they are not things that have to, they're not bound in language. They transcend language. And so when we're talking about a proposition, these two statements would be the same proposition even though they are different statements, because they are communicating or they're making the same claim. And so they would then have the same truth value because they would be identical to one another even though they are different statements. So I hope that helps. Okay? So, again, if you have questions about the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, or the law of identity, please ask in the discussion board. I want to make sure that we're able to have clear discussion about that. Okay, another types of arguments. We're going to look at different types, ways of arguing. So there's three basic ways that we argue. We will use two for this class, and the third one we use a lot in our life, but we're not going to use it very much in ethics. The first is deduction. If you use a deductive argument, or use the form of deduction to make an argument, then the advantage to that is that you have a guaranteed conclusion. If your premises are true and the structure of your argument is sound and it's a valid argument, then you have a guaranteed true conclusion. So deduction is a form of reasoning that provides a guaranteed conclusion from the premises. Okay? This is great. You have guaranteed truth, or guaranteed. You're not looking at probability of truth. You're looking at guaranteed truth. If your premises are true, if your structure is valid, then you are guaranteed to have a true conclusion if you use deductive logic. And that's great. We would like to have that kind of certainty. The problem is that there are very few things that we can make deductive arguments about. So deduction is great, however, it is not it's not able to be used in every kind of situation or even very often. So I want you to remember that. Deduction gives you a guaranteed conclusion. You're guaranteed to be a truth, the value of your conclusion. It's guaranteed, but there's very limited application where we can use deductive arguments. If you get to a point where you can use a deductive argument, you should, because you will have certainty in your conclusions, provided that the argument is correct. The next way of arguing is inductive, to use inductive reasoning or argumentation. And in this case, your conclusion is only likely. It is not guaranteed. So, definition of induction then is a type of reasoning that provides a likely but not guaranteed conclusion from the premises. So even if your premises are correct and your argumentation is valid, which we'll talk about the structure of that in a bit, then the best you get is this is probably true, not certainly true like you would with deduction. Now, that is great, but what that gives us is that we're not certain about our conclusions. We can just have probability estimates, say it's likely true, or it's maybe pretty likely true. The advantage is that there are many more things that we can use inductive arguments with over deduction. That's why you would use induction rather than deduction, because there's more of the world that we can put into this format, this form of an argument, that we can say more about the world. And deduction, there's very little. Now, the third type of reasoning, or types of arguments that we can use, is known as abduction. And this is what we would say is the best guess. And this is a form of reasoning that provides what we think is the best explanation from the evidence. This is a common way of reasoning and is often used in medicine and everyday activities. So, while abduction is kind of a combination approach, and it is looking for the best explanation, not necessarily one that is the most likely or that is guaranteed, but what is the best explanation. So when you go to a hospital, you say, I have these symptoms of A, B, and C, then what will typically be done is they'll say, okay, A, B, and C as symptoms are most commonly caused by condition 1 through 10, and then they will start to try to rule out conditions there. So you're trying to give the best explanation from the evidence. So if you perhaps have an animal, say you have a pet dog in the house, and you come home and your garbage is knocked over, and you keep this is an inside dog, and you have garbage strewn throughout your house, then you may reason that the garbage is strewn throughout the house because the dog got into the garbage and made the mess. And so that may be the best explanation for that. Now, it's possible that something else happened. Maybe someone came in and wanted to make the dog look bad. Maybe the cat did it to try to blame the dog. Who knows? But the abductive reasoning would look at that and say, well, the best answer for this would be that the dog did that. We use this all the time. If you are, you get up in the morning, you go out to start your vehicle, and it doesn't start, and you hear clicking sounds, or you hear engine trying to start, and it doesn't actually start, you may then assume that your battery is dead. And it could be your battery is dead. And that's probably the most likely thing that's happened. But that's a use of abductive reasoning. Now, abduction is great. We use it all the time. However, in ethics, we're not going to use that. We're going to use either deductive or inductive are our primary focuses. For academic work, that is what we're going to strive for, or providing inductive or deductive arguments. Abduction is a legitimate way to reason, to use logic. However, it is it's not as formal, and it's not what we're trying to accomplish here. So, all right. Now we're going to look at ways of evaluating arguments. I'm going to ask you to pause the video again and to use the link here to watch the video. This is a video that shows, again, another Monty Python clip, and it shows an argument that's made in the way of reasoning. I'd like you to watch that. I will pause now and give you, I want you to pause your video, watch this other video, and then come back and continue. Okay, so you've watched the Monty Python argument that we see here about whether the woman is a witch or not. So hopefully you enjoyed the video, and you may have pointed out, maybe we're looking at some of the ways they were arguing, the things that they were claiming, and you say, well, there's some bad things that are going on there. Yes, yes. So, when we look at evaluating arguments, and the Monty Python was just for fun, hopefully you enjoyed that, we do want to pick apart our arguments and use reason. When we start to evaluate arguments, we are going to look at the structure of the argument and the truth value of the premises. So there's two things we look at. Is the argument structured properly? And that's to ask, is the argument valid? In other words, is the argument laid out, the logic laid out in such a way that if the premises are true, then you would have a true conclusion. Now, if the argument is valid in its structure, and then if the premises themselves are true, then your conclusion will be true. In other words, if your logic is correct, and if the premises you make are true premises, then your conclusion will be true. An argument can, however, be valid and have false premises. So you can have an argument that is set up structurally correct, and you can have false premises, and that will then give you a bad argument. Okay? So, first let's look at a valid argument. Now this argument is valid. In other words, the premises are false, but the structure of the argument is correct. So, all humans have blue skin. All blue-skinned things have 3 heads. Therefore, all humans have 3 heads. So it's a simple argument, but the premises are false. All humans do not have blue skin. All blue-skinned things do not have 3 heads. So for the conclusion, all humans have 3 heads is false. But the logic is fine in the argument. The problem with this argument isn't the logic. The problem is the truth values of the premises. So let's look at the argument underneath it. Down here, this is the argument, this is the same structure, except the false premises have now been replaced with true premises, and then the argument you'll see is a good argument. It's sound. All dogs are animals. All beagles are dogs. Therefore, all beagles are animals. You see, that's a sound argument, and the proposition, or it's a valid argument, and the propositions are true, so we would call the argument sound. If your argument has true propositions and the structure of the argument is proper, then the argument is sound. And I believe that's our next slide, soundness. An argument is sound when it is valid and the premises are themselves true. So keep that in mind. When we're looking at arguments, you can have an argument that the logic is good, but the premises are false. And if that's the case, then it would be an unsound argument. You can also have an argument whose premises are true, but the logic is incorrect. And so you would have an unsound argument there. Okay? So when we evaluate arguments, we look at the logic, the structure of the argument, to see if the premises are true. Would the argument demonstrate or prove what the argument is trying to prove? And if the structure is correct, then you would evaluate the truth value of the premises. Okay? So two things we look at: the structure and then the truth value of the premises. Okay? And if you have both, then you have a sound argument. Now, forms of arguments, we're going to look at some of these. You have categorical syllogisms, hypothetical syllogisms, what's known as a constructive dilemma, and then reductio ad absurdum. These are forms of arguments that you will see, and we're going to touch on these briefly. Do not worry about memorizing this. I will just want you to be exposed to it. You will see some of the arguments in the class as we go forward. I want you to be able to say, if you have a question, go back and reference your notes to figure out how a particular argument should or should not be, but it's not something that you have to memorize. Okay? Now, for categorical syllogisms, there are 256 possible categorical syllogisms, but most of them are invalid. So even though that they are possible to construct, the logic is invalid, so it doesn't really matter. We're going to just look at a few categorical syllogisms so that you understand what we're talking about here. Okay? So, a categorical syllogism, the following is an example. All M are P, all S are M, therefore all S are P. So the M, the P, the S, those are just basically variables that you would be able to replace with whatever it is that you're referencing for. This is just a basic structure for you to work with. So all dogs are animals. So in this case, M would be dogs, animals would be P, and then S would be beagles. And we have the same argument we had on a previous slide. All dogs are animals, all M are P, all S are M, all beagles are dogs. Then we conclude all S are P, all beagles are animals. And that's a categorical syllogism. It's pretty straightforward. You're referring to categories of things, like in this case, all dogs, and then the category of animals, and then the category of beagles, and then you're making a conclusion. If all dogs are animals, and that is true, and if all beagles are dogs, that is true, then you would conclude that all beagles are animals is true. So you're making the statement, all dogs are animals, all beagles are dogs, therefore everything that is a beagle is an animal. Okay? So that's a categorical syllogism. Here's another example of a categorical syllogism. No M are P, all S are M, therefore no S are P. So in this case, we're changing what our variables are. We're saying instead of that all of these are all together, now we're saying nothing that is a dog is a cat. So M is dogs, P is cats, and S is still beagles. So no dogs are cats. Okay? Everything that is a dog is different from everything that is a cat, so there's no overlap, saying that no dogs are cats. All beagles are dogs. Okay? And then we can conclude that no beagles are cats. Pretty simple. Pretty straightforward. There's nothing that is a dog that is the same as a cat. So dogs and cats, there's no overlap. Everything that is a beagle is a dog, so everything that is a beagle is not a cat. Okay? Or nothing that is a cat is a beagle. That's what we're concluding there. Okay, next categorical syllogism, all M are P, some S are M, therefore all S are P. Now, all dogs are animals. So we're going back to the M for dogs and P for animals. Some companions are dogs. So S is for companions in this example, and M is still dogs. So everything that is a dog is an animal. Some things that are companions are dogs. therefore we would be able to conclude that some things that are companions are animals. Okay? Not every animal is a companion. Not every dog is a companion. Okay? But some dogs are companions, and not everything that is a companion is a dog or necessarily an animal. But from this we can conclude that some companions are indeed animals. Okay? The next one is a hypothetical syllogism. And this is a form of a pure hypothetical syllogism. If P, then Q. If Q, then R. Therefore, if P, then R. And we have an example down here. If I am a parent, then I have a child. If I have a child, then I have responsibilities. Therefore, if I am a parent, then I have responsibilities. Okay? And everything is hypothetical. It depends on the if part. So, for hypothetical syllogisms, you will see if and then phrases. Okay? If P, then Q. If Q, then R. Therefore, if P, then R. Now, this is not the form that you will normally see a hypothetical syllogism. You will tend to see them in one of these two ways because we want to actually conclude something. Now, this is called modus ponens, or the way of affirmation. And we start off with if P, then Q. And then we assert for our second proposition P. In other words, P is true. You could write that instead of just writing P, but you can't simply just state P as if it's true. And then you would then conclude, therefore, Q. So if P, then Q. P, therefore, Q. That's the logical structure of the argument. Let's put it into this example. If I am a parent, then I have a child. Now, the second statement is, I am a parent. Then I conclude, therefore, I have a child. Okay? So, that's the hypothetical syllogism, and this is modus ponens, or the way of affirmation. Now, it's important that you note that in the way of affirmation, you affirm the antecedent, not the consequent. So, if P, then Q, P is the antecedent, and Q is the consequent. For modus ponens, you affirm the antecedent. You affirm P. You do not affirm Q. Okay? So, if P, then Q. P is true. Therefore, Q must be true. That's modus ponens, or the way of affirmation. But that's not the only way that you can argue with a hypothetical syllogism. You can also deny something, or use the modus tollens, which is the way of negation. In this case, the same kind of things. If P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. Now, you might replace this symbolically with just a negative sign to say not Q, or you might say it is not true that Q, or that Q is false. There's a number of ways you could write this. It all means the same thing. Okay? If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So if I am a parent, then I have a child. I do not have a child, therefore I am not a parent. Okay? That's the way the logic works there. So, with the way of negation, you negate, or you deny the consequent, not the antecedent. So P is the antecedent, Q is the consequent. You deny the consequent, Q, not P. If you put not P there, you don't get the same conclusion as not Q. So, we will see that there are fallacies later on in this lecture where you do the opposite to a hypothetical syllogism as you're supposed to. You affirm the consequent, or you deny the antecedent. And you'll see that that doesn't work. Okay? The next is a disjunctive syllogism. So, where hypothetical syllogisms had if-then statements, disjunctive syllogisms will have either-or statements. And so we have our proposition either P or Q, not P, therefore Q. So we're saying either P is true or Q is true. And then we're denying one of them to be true. And since one of them has to be true, then since we're denying that our statement is either P is true or Q is true, P is not true. That's our second premise. We're denying that P is true. So therefore, our conclusion is that Q must be true. So here's an example. Either Miami or Birmingham is in Alabama. Miami is not in Alabama. Therefore, we conclude that Birmingham is in Alabama. Okay? So, but you may say, wait, well, what if What if they're both not in Alabama? Well, then our statement would be false. So either P or Q, if that is true, and then we deny one of them, the other must be true. Okay? So that is a disjunctive syllogism. Disjunctive syllogisms, you'll have either or. The next type of argument is a constructive dilemma. If P, then Q, and if R, then S, P or R, therefore Q or S. You use a constructive dilemma when you're trying to force someone to a limited set of options. So this is a little bit wordy, but let's look at this example. If the Democrats win the next presidential election, that would be the if P, then a Democrat will be president, that would be Q. So if P is Democrats win, Q is Democrat president. And if R, then S. If the Republicans win the next presidential election, then a Republican will be president. So if P, then Q, if R, then S. Those are two possibilities that this argument is saying. It's going to be either P, which will be Q, or it's either R, which will be S. And then here our second is P or R. One of those two will win. Either the Democrats win the next election or the Republicans do. Okay, and so for third-party candidates here, this argument is just dismissing that a third party could win, which is really irrelevant for what we're doing. But you have these two possibilities, P then Q or R then S, and the constructive dilemma says either P or Q is true. One of the two is true. So then your conclusion is that either Q or S will be the case. So either the Democrats win or the Republicans win, and so either a Democrat will be president or a Republican will be president. So a constructive dilemma is a way to limit people, an argument that will limit options to a few options, to whatever they are. I mean, there could be many options. You could go and list all of the political parties, and you could say, you know, the Democrats win, the Republicans win, the Libertarians win, the Green Party wins, the Tea Party candidate wins, or whatever it is. You could go on and on and on with all of these different political parties, and then you would have, so then either P or R or Q or B or whatever all these variables are, to basically say who would be president there. But the constructive dilemma is used to reduce things to a certain number of options and basically saying one of these options are the case. So if the Democrats win, then there will be a Democrat president. If the Republicans win, there will be a Republican president. Okay, that's the way the logic works. We'll see constructive dilemmas and how they're used later on in the course. But that's what I want you to know now, that a constructive dilemma tries to, it narrows the options to what are possible and forces someone to accept one of those conclusions. Okay? Now the next one is Reductio ad Absurdam, and this is an approach which means reduction to the ridiculous or reduction to the absurd. It takes a conclusion from an argument and shows how accepting that argument would lead to a contradiction or other obvious falsehood. Some examples of this would be a perfect chess program, or say that we would improve quality by firing the bottom 10%. So just for the perfect chess program, assume that I created a chess program and my claim was my chess program will never lose a game. It will always win every time it plays. Well, how could that claim stack up? If I were to play that chess program, it would probably beat me. However, it's a computer program. We could copy that program, and it would be an identical version of that program, and we could have it play itself. In chess, there's only a limited number of outcomes. One player is going to win, and the other lose, or vice versa. Or you could come to a stalemate. Now, the claim that if the claim is that this program always wins, if it plays itself, that's impossible for it to be the case that it always wins, because both outcomes, or all outcomes, would involve only one winner and either a loser or no winners. So you can get stalemate, which means nobody wins, or one wins and the other loses. So if the program plays itself, it would be impossible for that to say it always wins. So that would be a way to use reductio ad absurdum to the claim that someone has a perfect chess program. Another idea is someone says maybe we need to improve the quality of our students, say at the college, or the quality efficiency of our workers at our company. So we want to not have a bottom 10%, so we're going to fire the bottom 10% so that we have only, we don't have a worst 10%. Of course, the problem with that is that when you're referring to percentages are measurements of the whole, so if you had 100 people and you fired the 10 least performing people, you would still have 90 people that are remaining, but you would still have a bottom 10%. And those would just now be people that were previously in the bottom 20%. So you can't improve quality simply to say that we're not going to have a bottom 10%. You would have to have some kind of objective measurement. If you're producing things, maybe saying we're only going to have people that can produce X number of widgets per hour. Or if we're talking about students, you say we're not going to allow students who have GPAs below, some certain number, or students who make below certain grades will no longer be allowed. So, but you can't do it just as a percentage to say we're going to get rid of the bottom 10% so that we don't have a bottom 10%. That doesn't work. Okay. Next, we're going to look at the major fallacies. Not every argument that we're going to look at is a valid argument. When an argument is invalid, that it has some sort of fallacy within its structure. A fallacy is a mistake or in reasoning where a conclusion is drawn without adequate support. Now, you have two types of fallacies. Formal fallacies, and that's where your deductive argument has a structural issue, and you can just look at the argument and examine it and find that and say, oh, you should have done something, but you didn't do that right. That's a formal fallacy. Informal fallacies are detected from interpreting the content of the argument. So those are a little bit harder to identify, or they're informally identified. You look at the actual argument, the content of it, rather than just the structure. Okay, several formal fallacies we're going to look at: the undistributed middle, affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent, and affirming the disjunct. So this is going to be somewhat of a review of what we just covered, but it's showing how to do it wrong. So pay attention to this, and if you see something that doesn't look right, that looks similar to the proper structure we saw before, but a little bit different, it may in fact be a fallacy. So for an example here, this is an undistributed middle. Our example, all of the formalizing of this argument is all P is M, all S is M, therefore all S is P. So there's no reference here to the entire class of M. As a valid categorical syllogism must refer to the whole class of M. So let's look at this. All dogs are animals, so all dogs, which would be P, are animals. M, all cats are animals, that's S, all cats are animals. M, therefore all dogs are cats. Okay? So you see that we can't do that. We have to refer to the entire class of animals, and then we could say something about that like we did with the others. So all something about the animals, but we can't conclude that dogs are cats simply from this structure. You see that doesn't work. Okay, so that's known as an undistributed middle. Now, I'm pointing these out. Again, you don't have to memorize them. I just want you familiar enough to see that there could be some structural issues with our argumentation. Affirming the consequent is the next one. If P, then Q. Q, therefore P. So it looks very similar to what we did before with modus ponens, where you affirm the way of affirmation, right? But the problem is we did not affirm the antecedent, P. We affirmed the consequent, Q, and then concluded, P. So we did it backwards. Using modus ponens, you affirm the antecedent, not the consequent. So let's look at this example. If George Washington was assassinated, then he is dead. George Washington is dead. Therefore, George Washington was assassinated. So if P, then Q. Q, therefore P. You see that doesn't work, because there are other ways that George Washington could have died other than assassination, which we know that he was not, in fact, assassinated. So you can't affirm the consequent. You can only affirm the antecedent, not the consequent. So if you affirm the consequent, then you have committed the fallacy here of affirming the consequent. Which, by the way, I mean, you could still have something that turns out to be a true statement, but it doesn't matter because your logic is wrong. Your logic would not support the conclusion, even if it is the correct conclusion. All right, so deny the antecedent if P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. So you see, it's the opposite of what we did again. When we did modus tollens, you said not Q, you didn't do not P. So you deny the consequent, the Q term, you don't deny the antecedent, the P term. So if George Washington was assassinated, then he is dead. George Washington was not assassinated. Okay, that's true. Therefore, he is not dead. But that's the false conclusion there. You can't conclude that he's not dead because he was not assassinated. Again, because there are other ways that you can die besides assassination. All right, affirming the disjunct. This is very similar to our disjunctive syllogism, but we're doing the wrong thing. So we have either P or Q. Then we affirm P, say P is true, therefore then we conclude not Q. Denying a disjunct means that the other must be true. That's why the disjunctive syllogisms worked. Affirming the disjunct is true does not mean the other must be false. They could both be true. So we could have a statement, either P or Q, either Montgomery, P, or Birmingham, Q, is in Alabama. P, Montgomery is in Alabama, and then we conclude, therefore Birmingham is not in Alabama. Okay? So you can't affirm the disjunct. You have to deny the disjunct. Okay? So that's affirming the disjunct. It looks very similar to a disjunctive syllogism, but you need to deny the disjunct, deny one of the disjuncts in a disjunctive syllogism. Informal fallacies. We'll cover these fairly quickly. We'll try to go through these for us. So these are the different informal fallacies. Each of them has a slide. So let's just jump right in and wrap this up. A false dilemma. A false dilemma is an informal fallacy, and it occurs when someone argues that one must choose between a certain number of options when there is another option not presented. Okay, so this is like a constructive dilemma, except there is an option that is left out. So our example, you either support this policy or you hate America or any other group or thing. And we see this a lot in discussions. I wouldn't call them political discussions, but in the political landscape right now. So saying, if you don't support this policy, then you hate this group or that group, or you hate this person or whatever. Rather than dealing, you're saying there's only two reasons that, or really there's only one reason why you would not support a policy is because you hate a particular group. Well, what if you just think this policy is a bad policy? Or what if you think it's not going to work? That doesn't mean necessarily that you hate anybody or anything like that. So there is another option. Maybe you don't support this policy because of you think it's going to be ineffective, or you think that you're being lied to. There could be lots of reasons why you don't support a political policy other than you hate something. Okay, so that would be a false dilemma. Begging the question. We often hear this phrase thrown around that, if somebody brings up something, they say, well, that begs the question of, and then they ask a question. And that's not at all the way that we use it in philosophy. Begging the question is what occurs when in your argument you assume something that you're trying to prove. So, for example, here the statement, we should tell the truth because lying is wrong. Well, if you're going to try to say that, give an argument for why you should, that telling the truth is what you should do, then you're assuming that lying is wrong without showing it. So it's not saying that telling the truth, that you shouldn't tell the truth, or that lying is not wrong. However, this statement begs the question. It doesn't give us an argument for why truth-telling is what we should do. It simply assumes that lying is wrong. Okay, so that statement does not give us an argument. It begs the question because it assumes what it is trying to prove. So it doesn't prove anything, it just assumes it. And that's what begging the question means. Okay? Next is an argument from ignorance. An argument from ignorance claims that a proposition is true because it has not been proven false, or vice versa. It claims that something is either true or false because somebody hasn't proven it the other way. Okay, so no report of an alien encounter has been proven true, therefore aliens do not exist. So whether aliens exist or not doesn't have anything to do with whether anybody's encountered an alien. Perhaps aliens exist on the far side of the galaxy and we will never encounter them. But their existence does not depend on whether or not we have an encounter with an alien. So that's an argument for ignorance. You'll often see people say, well, no, that hasn't been proven, so that means it's false. Well, that is a fallacy to make that kind of a claim, and it's known as the argument for ignorance. All right, equivocation is something else that can happen, and that's when we use a word or phrase in different senses in different places in the argument. So we've already talked about using words in different senses. Here's a couple of arguments that show how this could be done. Pigs are filthy animals. All men are pigs. Therefore, all men are filthy animals. And of course, pigs here is being used in a different sense. One sense, you're talking about a member of the swine family, okay, that they're animals that live in unsanitary conditions. And then men or pigs would mean you're referring to the character or the proclivities of a man or of men in general. So to conclude all men are filthy animals is using equivocation because pigs are being used in different senses in the argument. So your conclusion is equivocal there. So understand that. Another example, Brad Pitt is really something. Something is fishy, therefore Brad Pitt is fishy. So something is being used in two different senses. The first one, Brad Pitt is really something, is kind of like saying that he's unique or he's interesting or he's great or some kind of term like that. And then something is fishy here is just referring to some unknown entity. Okay, and then to use Brad Pitt is fishy from that it's equivocating on how something is being used. Okay, the next fallacy is a straw man argument. A straw man argument occurs when someone argues against a weak argument and ignores stronger arguments. So this often happens in the political season. We'll probably see some of that this coming up semester. A claim here, this is an example, the government should not give up control of the healthcare system just because some people don't like the government. That would be a straw man argument of why perhaps government should be involved in an industry or something. And basically the person is claiming that not liking government, that the people who don't want the government involved just don't like the government. Well, they may, and that is not necessarily the case. And the argument about whether or not government should be involved in different sectors of the economy or healthcare or different things like that is not based generally on the fact that people like or don't like the government. There are other arguments. So a straw man, if you kind of conceive of a straw man standing in someone who's tied straw together into the shape of a man, and if you beat up a straw man, you haven't really accomplished anything because it doesn't do anything. A straw man is just a fake representative of a man. A straw man is not an actual person. And so if you argue against the weakest argument and you beat the weakest argument with your argument, then you haven't accomplished anything. So when we say that this is a straw man argument, we're saying that there are better arguments for a case, and if somebody defeats a straw man argument, then they haven't actually done very much at all. They have simply pushed over a very weak argument, and that's not what you need to do. If you're going to argue against a position, get the best arguments that people have or make for a particular position, and then argue against them. Don't ignore good arguments and defeat a weak argument and think that you've accomplished something. So if you see straw man, that's what we're talking about. Next is attacking the person, or what is known as an ad hominem attack. Attacking the person occurs when someone ignores the argument that an individual makes and undermines the person making the argument. So, for example, we should not listen to Al Gore on global warming because he is influenced by the Democratic Party would be an ad hominem attack. Okay? If Al Gore has something to say and an argument to make, then you ought to evaluate his argument, not say, well, he is, part of this group or that group or the other. It doesn't matter who he is a part of. What matters is his argument. And the argument must stand or fall on its own. Oftentimes, in political seasons especially, people will say, well, you can't pay attention to anything that they say because they, are part of this group, or they said this, or they're a bad person. Well, you may be a terrible person, but that doesn't mean your argument is bad. Okay? And arguments have to stand or fall on their own. So, it could be just the worst person ever that has a good argument. You can't dismiss it because they are a bad person. You have to deal with the argument. Okay? Appeal to popularity. An appeal to popularity is when reason is given for adopting a viewpoint, and that reason is the popularity of the viewpoint. So, a statement that would be an appeal to popularity would be, since most people believe in life after death, it must be true. Well, whether life after death is true or not doesn't have anything to do with whether or not people believe in it. Simply saying that the right thing to do is what the most people believe is not necessarily the case. After all, there was a time when most people believed that the earth was flat. And apparently that's gaining ground again. But the truth value of a claim is not based on its popular acceptance. So, appeal to popularity is not an effective or acceptable way to make an argument. That is a fallacy. Next is the fallacy of composition, and we have two that are related here. The fallacy of composition occurs when you attribute an attribute of the parts and say that it must apply to the whole. And so, understand that an argument done this way may, in fact, be true, but it is not a valid way to argue. So, if we were to say, for example, as we have here, couples in China have fewer children than couples in America. Therefore, we conclude, therefore, there are fewer children in China than in America. We might say, well, the average Chinese couple has somewhere around 1 because they have a one-child policy. American families have 2.5 kids on average, so there are more kids in America than in China. Well, we know that's wrong because even though Chinese couples have less children, there are so many more of them that you would have a greater number of children, even though each family has fewer children on average. So that would be an example of the fallacy of composition. However, there are times when you could have the correct answer. So if you had, for example, a Lego model, and it was all of the pieces of the Lego were red, all of the Legos were red, you would say each piece of the Lego is red, the model is red, so therefore the model itself is red. And that would be true. But you can't get there logically by saying just because every piece has this attribute, then that means the whole has the attribute. That would be committing the fallacy of composition. But it could possibly be true, but you just can't prove it that way. Okay? And the corollary to this, or the flip side of the coin, if you will, is the fallacy of division. And it's really the same kind of thing, but when you go from a property of the whole and say it must apply to the parts. Okay? So, if we were to say 10% of Americans are atheists, Wade Howell is an American, therefore Wade Howell is 10% atheist, that would be a way of misapplying and committing the fallacy of division. Okay, what would it even mean to say someone is 10% atheist? That's just kind of confusing, right? Another way you might look at this, another way you could do it is say, well, my automobile weighs 2,000 pounds, and so each part of my automobile must have the attribute of weighing 2,000 pounds. So, but your car seat or your steering wheel doesn't weigh 2,000 pounds. The whole car itself weighs 2,000 pounds. Not each piece of the car would not have the same weight as the whole. So that would be committing the fallacy of division. But again, if you have that red Lego example and you say, well, the Lego model as a whole is red, and every piece of it might actually be red, so it could apply to the parts. Something may apply to the parts, but you can't. Your logic can't get you there. You have to look at that on its own. Okay. Next is a false cause, and that's a presumption of causal connection between two events. We're getting into sports season, so sometimes you'll see this. If I don't wash my team shirt, they will win their next game. Therefore, not washing my shirt causes my team to win. Or something like the rooster always crows before the sun comes up. Therefore, the sun comes up because the rooster crows. This is also called ergo hoc propter hoc. That means before it happens, because it happens before, therefore it happens because of. So the rooster crowing doesn't make the sun come up, and whether you wash your shirt or not does not make your team win or lose. Those are false causes. Okay. A hasty generalization is another example. This is getting more into statistics, and some of you may take that later on. But hasty generalization occurs when you draw a conclusion from too small of an observation. So if we assume that we surveyed 10 people in the Lake City area and asked them if they approved of the job the president is doing, and suppose 7 of 10 said the president was doing a good job, that's what happens. And then we claim from that 70% of Floridians thought the president was doing a good job. Well, we haven't done what we need to do to make that kind of claim. If you take statistics, you can get a sense of population and how much you need to sample, how many people you would need to sample based on a population size and things like that. In addition, if we're only surveying people here in Lake City, this is just one part of the state, and people in Lake City may be very different from people in Miami and from people in Orlando and things like that. So we have to be careful that we don't cause a hasty generalization. And finally, a biased generalization. A biased generalization may occur when a conclusion is drawn from a group that may not represent the whole. Again, statistics, when you take that, if you take that, it'll help. But suppose we surveyed 1,000 college students and reported that the results we found applied to the entire population. That would be an example of a biased generalization. So the biased generalization, then, what that means is college students are going to be somewhat different than the rest of the population. And the things that are important to college students may be very different than things that are important to children, to senior adults, to working adults. So to say that 1,000 college students, that's probably a big enough survey. And that could apply to, you might be able to use that and say, hey, college students think this or that. But to say you only surveyed college students and you're trying to apply that result to the rest of the population would have some bias in it. Okay, that's going to be the end of the lecture. Please post any of your thoughts, comments, or questions in the lecture notes or the lecture video discussion, and we will carry on the conversation there. When you've completed all the assignments for this lecture in this module, then you can move on to the next one. I'll see you in the next lecture.